Hi, everyone. I'm Colleen Stanley, and welcome to the Sales Leadership Awakening podcast, where our mission is to help sales leaders bridge the knowing and doing gap. And of course, joining me today is my co-host, Stephen Rosen. And Stephen, you're looking rather dapper today.
Well, it's summertime. You got to look like you're out golfing on Thursdays and Fridays, even though I don't golf, but part of the look.
It's very good. As we always say, we are fortunate to have another great guest. So why don't you kick it off?
I want to welcome James Muir to our podcast. I've known James for a number of years, and he's not only a nice friend, but he also is a very, very sharp guy that you can learn a lot from. So, James, welcome. Can you tell us a bit about yourself, the company you work for, and a bit about your sales group?
Sure. It's great to be on. It's great to see you guys again. I have been in healthcare for over 30 years, both as a domain expert, we'll say, and as well as a salesperson. On the sales side, I've served every role that there is in selling. I'm an executive VP of sales right now for a revenue cycle management company based out of Phoenix. It's about a $40 million company. I have my own sales team. And so what makes me a little different than some of the other folks, I'm an author. My day job is managing salespeople and growing our company. It gives me a little more of a grounded perspective on how some things are. Some things sound like they're going to work, and then you go try them and they don't work, right? I have a very practical perspective on all that stuff.
You sure do. And combining both the practice and the theoretical, I think, is a great approach. Being able to try your ideas and see if they work, I think, is great as well. Our signature question on the Sales Awakening podcast is, what was your sales leadership awakening moment? Can you share that with our audience?
Sure. So I spent 16 years at a publicly traded company called NextGen Healthcare, and I got promoted from top salesperson to a regional vice president. I thought that was just a natural progression, right? That's how it worked. And then I realized about a week or two into that I'm like, oh my gosh, the skills that you need to do this job are completely different than what it takes to be a great salesperson. And that was shocking to me. At that time, this is a few years ago, there really weren't very many books out there you could go read that would tell you how to do this. So I got most of my understanding at that time in desperation from Skip Miller. I have all of his books, actually. Anyway, so I learned a lot from him, but now there's a lot better resources that you can get. But his books, they withstand the test of time. And the second thing I realized is I thought I could just throw everybody into an auditorium and then teach them what I did, and suddenly they would be pumping out little James Muirs all over the place. The truth is, in reality, every single salesperson is unique. They all have different strengths. They all have different weaknesses, and they're all in different places in their own personal development. What that meant, and this is the aha that I got, is really the most productive work is actually done one-on-one rather than in auditorium type setting. That was a bit of a wake-up call, because you'd like to think you can be efficient about it. But if you have a room full of 30 people, odds of you being able to hit with one topic and hit them all and get them all leveled up at the same is not realistic, because they're all in different places. So the real work happens when you're one-on-one with them, figure out what do they need, and then you're helping that person for what that person needs. So those two things.
Speaking to a group of 30 is an efficient way to do it, but it's not effective. So it's a great learning that many of us have learned, the transitioning into leadership roles.
Yeah. Stephen, that's funny because that's just what I wrote down as James was speaking there. So I give you credit, James, because that one-on-one, that's the hard work. We're all tempted, even though we're well-intended, to maybe do the group presentations, which have their place. One of the things from knowing about the work you do and the big background you have is, and especially with our positioning on bridging the knowing and doing gap, I'm sure you've seen this, perhaps with yourself or other sales leaders. So technically, they're doing all the right things. They're providing sales training. They've identified their ideal client profile, and yet they're not hitting their targets. Now, there can be a lot of reasons for this, but from your perspective, what's one that might be glaring out there and we're not working on?
That is such a good question. Because of Perfect Close, I get invited to come and help people improve their close ratios a lot, right? That's usually the reason that they're coming in. But after you do a discovery with them, very often we find out these guys don't have a closing problem. These guys don't have a closing problem. They have a messaging problem, right? Or their value prop. How they're articulating their value prop isn't working. And I'm telling you, I have seen, and I've been lucky enough to work with some of the biggest companies in technology and healthcare. And I have seen full-blown, large-scale product launches that are built around weak or virtually non-existent value propositions, which literally blows my mind, because you got like a lot of money riding on these product launches, right? But the ironic thing is I see it over and over and over again. And think about this. If you don't know what your value prop is, how in the world are you going to be able to communicate that to your customers and the people that you're hoping going to buy that either through marketing or through sales, right? It's just so foundational.
Where do you think that miss is happening? Because it could be one of two things that I've seen over the years is the messaging statement just isn't there at all. It's not customized to each buyer, or it's not what I call really empathetic. They sound like brochures instead of messaging statements.
Here's the thing I see over and over again. You go into a group and you say, all right, what is your product? You're just trying to learn what their product does so you can understand what their sales process is. What you learn is that all they did is they created this product, which may or may not have a real purpose in real life, but let's just assume that it does. Then they just abdicate the entire delivery of the value prop to a marketing department, somebody totally not
Okay.
them. I know this will come shocking. The marketing people actually don't know what you do. I know that sounds crazy. And so the reason it sounds like marketing drivel is because they're doing the best they can with nothing. So they say, oh, it's the most robust this, or they use all of this. It's called puffery in legal terms, right? It means nothing. And people pick up on that. That's what I see happening most of the time is people have abdicated. They think, oh, well, this person knows how to speak market ease better than anybody else. So let's just tell them to create the whole thing. And since there's a disconnect between how the solution actually delivers value and the person who has to write how that value is being presented to the market, it ends up being weak. It just ends up
Yeah.
being weak. Rather than it confess that say, hey, I don't know what we do, we need to sit down, they just go for it. The marketing department will do as good as they can with what you give them. So if you don't give them anything, you're going to get very low grade, weak messaging.
Isn't it amazing as sales leaders? And I know you probably spend a lot of time in ride-alongs, whether they're virtual meetings or actually in cars, but we don't have our marketing departments do ride-alongs because nothing replaces hearing the prospect or the customer actually speak. So I've always found that a big disconnect. And I find that fascinating. It's a great gap you've just uncovered for people.
Let me tell you how to bridge that gap. There's more than one way to do it, but a really great way. Just bring some of your clients in and have them present to your sales team, your marketing team, your ops people, and say, this is what we really value about what you do. And they will be able to articulate it in such a great way that the marketing people will just be writing down furiously. But believe it or not, a lot of people think that the marketing people know and they don't know. If you just have a customer come in and tell you, and I know that sounds super obvious, but I have seen it maybe 2 times in my whole career. One way that we address that for salespeople is I would do an internship. I would take a salesperson and I would put them out at a client site and make them an intern for between 2 weeks and a month.
Oh, I like
So
that.
they had to literally live what the client was doing day in
That's
and day
great.
out. And then later, when they're having a conversation with a prospect, they can say, yeah, when I did this, we did it like this. Oh my gosh, the credibility just goes through the roof, right? Because now they're speaking from personal experience and they understand what the customer is trying to do way better because they literally had to live it for a while.
Yes. Wow. I have never heard of that. That's a great idea.
I come from the pharmaceutical industry where messaging originates from marketing, positioning, messaging, but you don't know how many times that products are relaunched because they missed on the first go, even though they have focus groups, they have advisory groups for products when they launch in that industry. There's a lot of time and effort spent because there's so much money that's gone into the R&D on the product, global marketing, and yet messaging is still missed. There needs to be fine-tuned. James, how do you assess if the value proposition is missing the mark? Do you have some examples? Maybe you've shared some already, but are there some specific examples you can share where you've seen that? And how do you go about assessing that? Maybe before you launch, so you mitigate the relaunch, because I've always said you have one time to launch.
Who's watching? Well, if you're a publicly traded company, the market's watching. If you're a PE firm, the PE firm is watching. And of course, the public is watching. So if you blow it, very few companies will take a second run at it. Sometimes they will, but they're like, wow, how did we get that so wrong? I agree with you, right? Better to get it right the first time, but people do get it wrong quite a lot, actually. And we can chuckle. There's some pretty famous examples of stuff like that out there. But when I go work with a client and we try to figure out, let's just assess their messaging, the very first thing I look for is a very basic value prop that's permeating all their stuff. The first thing these groups need to do is they need to define what their value proposition is. Some have them, some don't. Some have them for their established products, but don't have them for new products. There's 3 things in a basic value prop. There's a metric, a direction, and a magnitude. A metric is, well, what's the thing you're improving, right? Direction is it going up or is it going down? And the magnitude is, well, how much is it going up? How much is it going down? Those three things are basically the basics of it. Once you've got that, you've got a formula. Your formula is direction plus metric plus magnitude. So example would be like, we improve close ratios on average of 22%, or we improve net revenue capture by 3 to 5%. Maybe you could do it dollars instead. We improve net revenue capture on an average of 3 to 11 million, something like that. Those are all very basic value props. And so if I see that, great. Then we look for the next thing. Once you've created whatever your value prop is, then you can start to trick it out. There's basically 6 different ways you can trick it out. You can add target statements so that when you're either writing or when you're speaking, the person you're speaking to can hear themselves in the target statement. We work with hospitals with more than 3 facilities. Okay. Then if you're one of those, then you're like, oh, okay, this message must be for me, right? You can add a mechanism of action, which is what's your secret sauce that makes this thing work? You can add the time to get a return. And I refer to that as soonness. How soon am I going to get my return? And there's some science behind that. There's risk reduction or guarantees. I call that sureness. How certain am I that I'm going to get the return that you're promising, the value prop that you just mentioned? Then there's impacts or add-on benefits or enabling benefits. That is, once you produce the return, sometimes that creates this cascade of other benefits that you can pile on. And the last is stories that illustrate the point. So just to give you an example of one, because usually people ask when I give all that out there. So I'm going to give you one that I did for a client called Streamline Health. These guys had some technology that helped improve revenue capture for hospitals. This is not verbatim how people say it. You just teach your sales team this and you give it to your marketing and then they rework it in lots of different ways. Okay. But I'm going to say it and you'll hear all 6 of those things in this. So we specialize in helping hospital systems with 3 or more facilities improve net revenue capture by 3 to 14 million in as short as 60 to 90 days. In fact, we don't even invoice you until the system's completely paid for itself. So there's no risk there. We're able to accomplish that by using a unique collection of 4,500 proprietary and custom rules that are constantly updated, along with some dedicated specialists that we use to help you optimize those rules and then turn that feedback into actionable advice and workflows in your organization. We were able to do that for Memorial, which in my world, everyone would know who that is. And we improved their net capture by 14 million just in their first year. And they actually went on and ended up using that to put on a whole new wing on their main hospital. So if you listen closely to that, and there's probably 6 sentences or so there, you can hear all of the elements in there. But the very basic value prop is simply that they improve net revenue collection by 3 to 5%. What you're going to do is you're going to deliver that to both marketing and to the sales team. It gets reworked in different ways. For example, if they're writing an email, they're not going to just paste that in as an email. But if they're having a dialogue with the customer, that might end up having 2 back and forth before you've covered all that stuff. But all of the elements are there in the messaging. But the very crux of it, right, is just that very short improving net revenue capture in that example.
Okay, thanks for clarification, because I'm thinking, oh my God.
So that's not one.
Sometimes a rep doesn't remember the name of their product.
There's some reasons to add all of those things.
I
You
get
can
it now.
certainly have a basic value prop, but one of the reasons you tell a story is because there's literally thousands of mental hooks that allow them to remember the story. So if you literally did nothing more, your value prop in a story will probably create the biggest return for you because they can at least remember the little story behind the return that you did. But if you just give them the fact, even though facts are strong, like the metric that you're improving, they're not as memorable. And so people tend to forget those things. And the more dramatic the story, the better.
So James, I'm curious with your own sales team. So you were able to easily deliver this value prop. What I've seen when I used to teach sales training is people would stumble and bumble over value props. They weren't customized by the buyer or the industry. So as a sales leader in your own company, what are 2 or 3 things that you're doing weekly, monthly to make sure that your team is articulate in delivering the value prop? Because it's one thing to teach it, but it's another thing to say it conversationally, as if it's the first time you've ever made such a statement.
Yeah. So the first thing is I have a weekly meeting with them. It's a 90-minute long meeting where they drive the agenda and it's just an improvement session. They tell us where their challenges are and then we work on those. So sometimes it's messaging, but sometimes they pick other things that they want to work on during that session. So I like it being driven. As long as you make it safe for them to do that, it'll be a great session. If you're the kind of manager that comes down on people, what happens is they just climb up and then you won't get any interaction
Sure.
from your team on there. But I don't have that problem. We run long all the time if there's not some meeting right up at the end of that session. That's one of the things we do. The other, though, is we teach them this messaging. And then as a sales leader, you have to decide that you're going to let them try it and possibly fail at it. I usually will be invited to most of the significant sized opportunities, and I'll just sit there and I'll let them drive, but I'm more like a safety net. So I'll let them go. And I've just learned over the years that at first you think they're destroying the whole opportunity, but they're really not. You have a lot more latitude than you might think you have. They can do it wrong and it'll still work out. So I just relax. And then they'll throw it to me if they feel like they're drowning. They'll say, well, maybe James, you can add something to that. Of course, I'll add my 2 cents and then they can hear how I might have done that same thing that they just did. But it does give them a chance to practice in real life, which is a little different than a role play, because in real life, your adrenaline is pumping. When your adrenaline is up like that, it causes you to remember the experience much, much better, regardless of how it turns out. If you fail, you will remember the failure. If you succeed, you'll remember that triumphant moment where you succeeded. We want to create that crucible that creates that learning. It took me a lot of years before, instead of me just jumping in and trying to do the whole thing for them, to try to use this as an opportunity to grow them.
In your group sales meetings, do you do drill skill where you have everybody, okay, here's the skill we're going to work on. This is messaging today, go. And everyone has to deliver their value prop in front of the group, because to your point, that puts a little bit more stress on the situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a safe environment, right? We remind everybody, hey, we're doing this role play in front of everybody because better to do it now, right? In front of all of your friends than to do it in front of the client where it's a high stakes thing. But I like to do it in both. You got to give them a little chance to practice before you just throw them to the wolves.
I've seen too many that don't practice, and then they're shocked when they're on the call because the 30-second value proposition turns into 30 minutes, right?
Oh my gosh. I had one just about 4 weeks ago where it was a really big deal. We let the salesperson, Kelly, why don't you answer that question, right? I did. Really, she blew it. This is like almost a $2 million opportunity. Me and my CRO are on the call. We're like, I don't know if we can rescue this.
Well, you know, James, it was interesting. I was working and they were a rather large international client, again, back when I was doing sales training. And one of the lessons I learned from one of their executives is he said, storytelling is the only thing that's going to work at our level. And you mentioned that as one of your 6. And that just reminded me, because in some cases, a typical value proposition can work with certain buyers, but he was very adamant with me. Storytelling is the only thing that works with our buyers. And that was a good lesson learned for me. I don't know if you found that same experience.
Yeah, well, I think it depends a little bit on the industry. Let me just tell you what happens psychologically. If you deliver a value prop, you improve X by Y amount, right? The thing that happens next is not, oh, that was so persuasive. I believe you. I want to buy your stuff. That is not what happens. What actually happens next is, yeah, right. Right? They're very skeptical. That creates a gap where they want to say, yeah, how are you going to do that? What's the way? So the mechanism of action and the story fill that gap.
There you go.
I always say this is the thing that we have. In fact, this client did it like this. Honestly, the better the story, the more detailed, the more dramatic the story, the more they're going to remember it and the more persuasive it is. There's a lot of behavioral economics, but there's a lot of cognitive anomalies around why storytelling is so effective. And there's a lot of books out there on it, because the truth is it works. It's very effective.
People remember it and they can relate to what you're saying.
They'll be able to anchor it. But if you just only give them the value prop, it's really not enough. You're probably even better off just telling the story without the value prop. If you literally only had 2 seconds, you're better off telling the story and they'll say, okay. And then they'll draw you into the rest of the pieces of the messaging that you've got prepared. But anyway, what I look for is I'll go to somebody's website and I'll say, is there any value props here at all? And the best place to usually find them, so if you're looking at a vendor or something like that, is you go look at the case studies to see. And if their case studies just say that the client's life was improved in some way, I know that they don't have very strong value prop, because they have never taken the time to measure the difference that they actually make for the client in terms that can be monetized.
Right.
And for the record, there are industries where people don't buy things for money reasons, right? So my son does luxury stuff. He sells Rolexes and Patek Philippe watches and all that stuff. None of those people, you cannot do an ROI on that. They're buying that because they're buying ego. And it's a totally different kind of sale.
Absolutely.
So, but in B2B sales, which is what I have done, You can't persuade someone to spend $2 million. There's no one who is fast talking enough to get them to do that. So you're going to have a business case that makes sense to have them spend the $2 million. You're never going to be able to make any kind of a sale unless you can say, hey, there's a return here, and here's how you get the return.
Absolutely. Good.
Great insights. Colleen, well, tell me what your biggest takeaway was that we can share with our audience, because our goal is to offer 1 or 2 gems. There was a lot in there, James, and we really appreciate that.
I just really admire, James, that you're doing the one-on-one coaching sessions, because they are so easy to push off due to operations issues or other internal meetings. And I think giving the 6 areas that you can tangibly assess, hey, if I've got these 6 things included in my messaging, then I'm going to set my sales team up for more success, because I have just seen way too many hardworking sales teams. They're doing all the right things, but the problem is what's coming out of their mouth or getting translated in email, LinkedIn, whatever the medium is, it's just not landing. They're falling into that working harder, not smarter bucket. So those are my 2 takeaways. How about you, Stephen?
Well, this will be a first, because I wrote down coaching and the one-on-ones with people, although it may not be messaging, but it's a great way to be out there and see if the messaging is being delivered, how it's being delivered, how it's resonating with the client. So for me, the takeaway, and I'm very big on this, there's nothing that is more important for a sales leader to do than to be out in the field coaching their salespeople, observing. Maybe you got to jump in once in a while, but there's nothing like observational coaching. And if you're trying to fine tune and make sure reps are delivering, that's the only way to do it. James, I applaud that as well. And I think most managers realize that they need to be doing it. Not all of them do it. As we wrap up a really insightful episode of the Sales Leadership Awakening podcast, both Colleen and I hope you've gathered valuable strategies to close that gap between knowing and doing. And
Well, one more thing.
James, I'd like to recognize that if any of your sales leaders who are listening feel that you're stuck in deals, James Muir has a great way to help you unstick those deals and move them into sales. So his new book is just coming out. I saw him signing 50 copies. So make sure you get one right away.
Yeah. Congratulations, James. That's a lot of hard work.
Yeah, super excited about it.
Yes. Wonderful. Yeah. And thanks for the copy.
Thank you guys for having me on the show.